everything that we humans do is an approximation to what's going on, right? Everything that we describe as, let's look at the moon and let's approximate the moon as a perfect sphere. And then you say, well, as a perfect sphere, if you rotate the moon in any possible direction, if it's a perfect sphere, you're going to get the same thing. A perfect sphere has this beautiful rotational symmetry in every direction, but the moon doesn't, because the moon is not a perfect sphere. So, it's this joke that let's consider a spherical cow, right, as an example of an approximation. But of course, and it is very useful as approximation. So I think what happens very often in physics and mathematics is that we confuse the map with the territory.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. This episode is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. More about them later in the show. Hey everyone, I am really delighted to introduce my guest for today, Professor Marcelo Gleiser. Marcelo is the Appleton Professor of Natural Philosophy at Dartmouth, a world-renowned theoretical physicist and public intellectual. He's authored hundreds of technical and non-technical papers and essays, and 6 books in English, translated to 15 languages, the latest being Great Minds Don't Think Alike. His popular writings explore the historical, religious, and philosophical roots of science. Marcelo is a Fellow of the American Physical Society, a recipient of the Presidential Faculty Fellows Award from the White House, and a founder and past director of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth. He co-founded NPR's 13.7 Science and Culture blog, and currently writes for BigThink.com. He's the 2019 Templeton Prize laureate, an honor he shares with Mother Tereza, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, and scientists Freeman Dyson, Jane Goodall, Francis Collins, and Sir Martin Rees. Marcelo, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining today.
My pleasure, Brandon. Yeah, I love what you're doing, so I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, let's talk about what drew you to physics in the first place. And you grew up in Rio, and I think you were first drawn to biology, right? And what drew you to become a physicist?
Right. So I grew up in Rio, right by the beach, the famous Copacabana beach. And so Rio is the kind of city that, even though it's a very big city, it's really squeezed on all sides by nature. You have the ocean in front, the Atlantic, and then behind the city, you have the Atlantic forest, that enchanted Darwin when he came by, and these very dramatic old mountains. So everywhere you look, you're going to see some kind of life. So you're right. Initially, I was more interested in the exuberance of life in the tropics. And I was also, and I'm talking about my early teenage years, I was also shocked and profoundly worried. I don't know why, but somehow intuitively worried about the destruction of the environment that was being perpetrated by our project of civilization. So that was something that bothered me profoundly already when I was a kid. And switch into more physics-related questions, I think came because when I was 6 years old, my mother passed away in somewhat tragic circumstances. And when you have a 6-year-old boy that does not have a mom, life basically turns upside down, and you start to think about what is the meaning of everything, why this happened to me, what is time, why does time end for some people but continue for others, is death really the end of everything? So the world of fantasy and nature became very deeply existential, so to speak. And initially, I was drawn into religion and some sort of a mystical approach to things. But then when I was 13, I found out that my family had a connection to Einstein. In fact, quite an interesting one. So in 1925, so 4 years after Einstein got his Nobel Prize, he was fundraising for the Zionist cause, around the world. So he came to South America, he came to Brazil, to Rio, São Paulo, to Buenos Aires. And in Rio, his hosts were related to my family, so my grandfather from the mother's side was one of his hosts, and the other host was this is a long one, my stepmom's uncle. So I guess it would be my step grand uncle. And they took a picture together, and that picture stayed in the family. Einstein autographed it. And when I was 13, being a Jewish boy, I got a present for my bar mitzvah, which was the famous Einstein photograph, And so I was kind of like shocked. I already knew about Einstein, of course, but then I decided to actually learn about him. And that made me completely fascinated by the power of physics to actually think about the structure of space and time and the origin of the universe and the fundamental nature of reality. And that sort of refocus, in a sense, my interest in nature, but also my somewhat mystical takings of why are we all here, and say, wow, you can actually be a scientist and be asking these kinds of questions. So that was, in a sense, my transition into physics.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you've had quite a journey in physics, and as well as a writer. Tell me, in your work today, where do you encounter beauty? What does that mean to you as a physicist, and where do you find it?
Yeah, so beauty is a very tricky word, right? Because it's a very culturally anchored and very subjective. So what to me may be beautiful to others may not be beautiful. I mean, a lot of people, especially in the theoretical physics and pure mathematics kind of world, I noticed that you talked to Myra Livio. He is one that has written very nicely about one way of thinking about beauty in nature as this sort of what I would call a Platonic view of reality, where, what you have is nature is too ordered in order to not be mathematical at its very, very root. So the fact that we humans mathematically can kind of discover, some people say, is it invention or is it the discovery? That's a big, long conversation. Could be a whole podcast right there, that we uncover, let's use uncover the mathematical blueprints of nature is kind of extraordinary. So people would attach themselves to this notion with what I would call religious devotion. Nature is beautiful. And like John Keats said in his poem, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. So the notion being that if I uncover the mathematical beauty of nature, I'm actually discovering the truth of nature, meaning mathematics is a bridge between our minds, the human mind, the way we think about reality, and what's really out there in the world, right? So that's a very realistic way of thinking about what's going on. And in the beginning of my career, I was completely taken by this because I said, of course, I mean, there has to be a key to the secrets of existence, to the mystery of who we are in this natural world. And if science is the gateway to that thing, then let's be a scientist. And who are the prophets of this way of thinking? Well, lots of wonderful ones, including Einstein and Newton and Feynman and many others, that would say, yes, you go and you look for fundamental mathematical truths in nature, and that is the way to get to know how the world works. And I'm like, great. And what is the ultimate goal of this? The goal of this is to show that all of nature is actually the product of a mathematical structure, which people call the unified field theory, right? Or the theory of everything.
Yeah, one simple equation that describes everything that is at the foundations of reality, right? That's the quest.
Yeah, I remember in the 1980s when I was in grad school, the zeitgeist was, hey, we are going to be able to put the whole of the universe in a t-shirt in a single equation.
Right, right.
And that was like,
Yeah.
wow. I mean, how could you not be wowed by such a possible adventure, right? So as a young theoretical physicist, I said, of course I have to go after this. I need to be part of this group, of people that are trying. So in the 80s, when I was doing my PhD in England, I did joined the string theory, which was by the time the most powerful way of thinking about these mathematical hidden structures. And I'm like, Einstein himself spent the last 20 years of his life trying to find the so-called unified theory. And he failed, but it was a very valiant attempt, so to speak. And I'm like, I just want to keep doing this. I mean, what privilege, to have a life where you can actually spend your time teaching people about the beauty of science and pursuing the deepest secret of all, right? So I was completely enamored by the whole idea of going for it, finding the theory of everything.
So what happened then? I mean, you essentially distanced yourself from that pursuit of unification. Right?
Yeah, so then I grew up. So basically, what happened is, yes, I pursued this. I wrote lots of papers. My PhD thesis was on stuff like this. And my postdoc, my first postdoc in particular at Fermilab, which is a big high energy physics laboratory, is the CERN of United States, so to speak, was very much devoted to this until I went to the University of California in Santa Barbara to do my second postdoc at the Institute for Theoretical Physics. I guess now it's called the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics, where I met not just people that were working in high energy physics, string theory and cosmology, but actually folks that were working in condensed matter physics, phase transitions, more applied stuff. And then I realized that the universe of physics was much broader than this kind of I would call it semi-religious pursuit of the theory of everything, like this monotheistic way of thinking about the world. That, in a sense, what was really interesting to most of these people was not the perfect symmetries. Of course, they're very useful, right? And we use them all the time. But it was really the asymmetries of things. And then I started to say, but wait, it's not just them, because in particle physics, asymmetries are extremely important, right? Because if you start to look at things more carefully, the asymmetry in nature plays a tremendous role. And one of the most important of them, I can go and list a bunch of them, but one of them is the famous matter-antimatter asymmetry. So what does that mean, right? The idea here is, okay, we're all made of matter, like of electrons and protons, etc. But there's this other kind of particle in nature, which is called antiparticle. And people say, ooh, does it go up in gravity? Does it have a sort of mysterious? And the answer is no. Basically, antimatter is simply matter with sort of different properties. So an electron has negative charge, but it has a certain mass. And the antiparticle, so it's sort of like a mirror world, right? And the antiparticle of the electron is called the positron. Positron, positive. It just means it's very much like the electron, but it has the opposite electric charge, right? And we see those things, and it's really beautiful that particle physics has discovered this kind of matter. It all started in, believe it or not, it started almost 100 years ago with Paul Dirac, when he wrote an equation that basically predicted the existence of these things. They found it. And then the big problem became, wait a second, because if you have as many particles of matter as particles of antimatter in the universe, what would happen is that every time those two collide, they disintegrate into a puff of very high energy electromagnetic waves, like they're called gamma rays, but so very high energy light. So if matter and antimatter existed in the same amounts in the universe, we wouldn't be here. The universe would be a completely different place. It would be a place filled with radiation and not much more. So without that imbalance that exists in nature between matter and antimatter, there is more matter than antimatter, we wouldn't be here. And then the question becomes, why? Why is there such an asymmetry at the fundamental level? And nobody knows, right? And what we do know, and here's really interesting, is that this asymmetry somehow is related to another kind of asymmetry, which is very existential, which is the asymmetry in time. So it turns out that the asymmetry that relates matter and antimatter is related to the fact that we all know that time always flows forward. right? And there's a deep entanglement of these ideas there that we still do not understand. But long story short, when I started to think more about not just the symmetries, but the fact that what we want is not so much the symmetry, but we want to break those symmetries, because when you break the symmetries is when stuff happens, right? And you look around yourself and you say, okay, where is perfection in nature? Right? I mean, is a rose perfect, symmetrically perfect? Is a cloud perfect? Is a tree perfect? Is your face perfect in terms of perfection? And you realize that it isn't, right? That everything is imperfect in nature. And say, this is trying to tell us something, that yes, symmetry is a very profoundly efficient tool in physics and mathematics, and we use it all the time. But the nuances with which nature creates structures really come more from these imbalances than from a perfectly balanced nature.
Yeah, I mean, I recently interviewed Ard Louis at Oxford and their group. Now, they found that there is a sort of disproportionate tendency for nature to produce symmetric shapes, but all of those symmetric shapes, and his argument is because the algorithm is much simpler to generate symmetric things than non-symmetric things, but all of those symmetric shapes are slightly asymmetrical. There's imperfection built into everything that we even consider symmetric, which is quite astounding. At the level of laws, though, I mean, that's one of the things, I think Mario was talking about, where physicists really care about symmetry matters for laws to be translated across, space and time and so on. I mean, is that really essential for laws of nature to exist? Do we need some kind of symmetry at that level, or what do you think?
I think that we have to understand something very, very important about laws of nature, right? Which is that everything that we humans do is an approximation to what's going on, right? Everything that we describe as let's look at the moon and let's approximate the moon as a perfect sphere. And then you say, wow, as a perfect sphere, if you rotate the moon in any possible direction, if it's a perfect sphere, you're going to get the same thing. A perfect sphere has this beautiful rotational symmetry in every direction, but the moon doesn't because the moon is not a perfect sphere. So, it's this joke that let's consider a spherical cow, right, as,
Right.
as an example of an approximation. But of course, and it is very useful as approximation. So I think what happens very often in physics and mathematics is that we confuse the map with the territory. And that's something that I think is very pertinent to this conversation because, if you consider that the territory is what's really out there, okay? And what we do as humans is that we interact with physical reality through our senses and our instruments, and we create maps of the reality that we can see, right? And of course, a telescope and a microscope, they will expand the map, they'll make it more nuanced. But the map, and this is what's important, the map is never going to be a precise replica of the territory. It's always going to be an approximation of that territory,
Yeah,
right?
you don't want to, one-to-one map would be like Borges says, yeah, that's sort of the most
Exactly.
useless sort of thing, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, the perfect map, like in Borges, is one paragraph short story is the territory is as big as the territory, and that's just useless, right? But that short story that I suggest everybody reads, it's I think it's called On the Rigor of Science. One of the translations is in English is which is a one paragraph story, is that the futility of trying to pretend, or the futility of believing that what we actually represent as nature is nature, and forgetting that what we actually do is we approximate. And yes, within our approximations, absolutely, symmetries are very, very important. They open gates to new discoveries, and that's beautiful and powerful. And of course, we all have to do that. But we should not think that because our approximations describe nature as this perfect thing, like everything is perfectly conserved, and energy momentum is conserved, and angular momentum is conserved, and electric charge is conserved, that is how nature is. That is how nature is according to the way we look at nature. And I think that brings about a sense of humility because, it would be profoundly arrogant, in my opinion, to believe that what we can say about the world is what the world is. What we can say about the world is what we as humans perceive of the world. And that is very much anchored in, first of all, in our experience of reality.
You're listening to Beauty at Work. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. Templeton Religion Trust supports projects as well as storytelling related to projects that seek to enrich the conversation about religion. To learn more about them, visit templetonreligiontrust.org. This episode is also sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, a global research center located at the University of Southern California. IACS works to create dialogue, spark ideas, and sustain academic research on Catholic thought, creative imagination, and lived experience. Learn more at iacs.usc.edu. If you're enjoying the show so far, please subscribe to our podcast and take a moment to leave us a review. Well, let's talk about experience. I mean, you've written this article recently about the blind spot that many of us have, particularly in science, when it comes to experience, right? We discount the role of our situated experience as humans, and that blind spot is partly responsible for the existence of scientific materialism as a worldview. Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so I just finished a book, actually, with Evan Thompson, a phenomenal philosopher from the University of British Columbia, and Adam Frank. And so the book is called The Blind Spot, right? And it's about experience and the idea of reality. And it is a very in-depth analysis and critique of how science sometimes tangles itself into knots by not understanding that there are blind spots in the way we look at reality. And the most fundamental of those blind spots is, and this comes from a school of philosophy called phenomenology, like Edmund Husserl and Alfred North Whitehead and people like that, where they say, do not confuse, how you describe reality for reality itself, which is very similar to what I was just saying before about the map and the territory. In fact, this analogy of the map and the territory appears all the time. And the blind spot is essentially the neglect of experience, our physical experience of the world, as being essentially where everything begins. So what we do is, we use an example in the book, which is the example of temperature. Okay, what is temperature, right? And nowadays, we think of temperature as something that is real, right? Like temperature exists, is real, but temperature is not real. What is real is our sensation of hot and cold. That you feel hot, you feel cold. And then from that sensation, which is primal, it's how it begins, to a description of these changes in sensation by something that we call temperature, you needed 300 years or more of science. Okay. So to go and quantify by a thermometer what you mean by hot and cold, a lot of stuff had to happen, right? And so again, the thermometer is a map of our sensation of temperature. But temperature itself doesn't exist. It's a construction, it's a narrative that we are creating to describe ultimately what we mean by hot and cold. And what happens there is that if you look at the history of science, and the way we structure the book is an MIT press book that hopefully will come out in about a year or so. If you look at the history of science and the way we broke the book down into, let's see if I remember this, first the problem itself, then we do an analysis of time, the notion of what is time. Okay, that one is a very complicated story, right? I mean, the way physicists and philosophers talk about time. And then we go on to, St. Augustine, way before science, had this thing about time, right? And then we go into cosmology, the notion of the origin of the universe. is that a knowable question or is that an unknowable question? And why scientists tend to think that it's knowable and why we think it's unknowable within the framework of science, anyways. And then we go on to talk about the concept of matter, materialism, right? And the notion of the existence of atoms and particles and quantum mechanics and how do you interpret quantum mechanics? And then we move on to the consciousness, the nature of consciousness. And at the very end, we talk about the question of planetary awareness, how those scientific notions kind of percolated through our mindset, especially across the Industrial Revolution and even before then, to kind of position ourselves above everything else in nature, and why that is a disastrous way of thinking about who we are, in the world right now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, and this work has ramifications for, I suppose, the kinds of philosophical assumptions a lot of scientists carry, right? And I think materialism is one of the ones that I think you critique in the article that I think you put out a couple of years ago. But that is a very attractive, beautiful prospect for some scientists who sort of think that that's one of the things modern science gives us, is a secure foundation for understanding reality, where you can dismiss the existence of anything that's non-material. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so talking about these things is not saying that there is something else which is non-material. So you have to make a distinction here. So there is not, we do not know, right?
Right. Yeah.
We do not know, but you could have a narrative of reality which is perfectly materialistic, but it's also aware of the fact that the way we describe the world is full of blind spots, right? And you have to take that into account. So what Alfred Whitehead and Husserl said, and Merleau-Ponty and friends said, is that you have to be careful not to reify your theories, meaning to make sure that what you think is energy and momentum is not something that exists in the world, but it's really a representation of how we measure the world. So before anything, science is really about our interaction with physical reality, either through our senses and or through our instruments. And so, you say, look, the Hubble Space Telescope is seeing this galaxy which is 10 billion years old. And you say, yes, and it is, but there's a lot of translation that is going on here. The galaxy is there, right? There's no question about it. But the way we interact with it, right, is through what? Finally, is through vision. You have let's say, an ultraviolet telescope or an infrared telescope in the case of very far away things. We don't see an infrared. So we wouldn't see a thing, but what we do is we remap the information from those images, which we cannot see, into things that we can see. So there is always this translation of what's out there to things that we can perceive through our senses. But people forget that, right? And they say, of course, my field theory that describes electrons as quanta of a certain field is real. And that's the problem. That's what Whitehead would call subreptitious substitution. They're always Whitehead or Husserl, which is the idea that you are beginning to substitute a theory for something that is real. Okay. And a theory is not real. A theory is a representation of what's real. And that's the problem. So when people look for the symmetry, we always forget that theory, for you guys who are scientists and physicists, you write a Lagrangian. That Lagrangian is full of assumptions and simplifications about what it is that you're describing. And it is a great approximation to what's going on, just like Newton's theory of gravity is beautiful to describe how the moon goes around the Earth. All you need to know is the masses of each one of them, the distances between them, and bingo, there you are. But the moon and the Earth are much more than just that. That is just something that is useful to describe that particular. So that is the danger, when you start to think of your theories as the world as is, as opposed to representations of the world.
Oh, that's a great caution. I recall Frank Wilczek talking about how we might get very different physics if we imagined doing physics from the perspective of a bird or of a spider, right? So, because a bird, I think, would more naturally grasp relativism than we would, relativity rather. So,
yeah, there's a famous quote by Heisenberg before we go there, which says that what we see is not nature, but nature subject to our questioning. Meaning, is the questions that we are asking about nature, that the ones that we try to respond. And that, in a sense, couches the whole conversation. There are all these other things out there that we're not asking questions about yet or have in the past that also nature, but we are looking at nature in, of course, the more we advance scientifically, the more spectacular and the broader our conversation is. So sometimes this stuff that I say is viewed as a little anti-scientific, and it's exactly the opposite. What I'm trying to do is to show how awe is an essential part of science. But we should also at the same time be careful not to think that science is completely not to equate science with truth, because truth is a very dangerous and elusive kind of word. And the problem with these ultimate theories of everything, which philosophically, that assumption, it's nonsense, right? You cannot have an ultimate theory of everything or anything because knowledge is always advancing, right? You cannot say that, okay, we are having a theory of everything now because we have the four forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong nuclear forces. That's it, folks. All we have to do now is bring them all together and we have a theory of everything. But then, how can you say that knowing that, hey, in 5 or 10 years, some guy or person in some laboratory may discover a fifth force of nature? And you go, damn, okay, my theory now is incomplete. It's not the theory of everything anymore. It's the theory of almost everything. And the point is that you have to put that one in. And so I think there's a lot of hubris, in making final affirmations about our knowledge of anything, including science.
You have this beautiful metaphor of the island of knowledge, right? That where you, I think you explain the sort of limits of science. Could you say a bit about that metaphor?
Sure. So that metaphor came as an effort to try to kind of synthesize everything that I'm saying in an image that is appealing to a lot of people. So the idea is very simple. So imagine that everything that we know fits in an island. And this island, of course, and what do we know? Well, we can talk about science, but not just science. We can talk about the arts. We can talk about literature. It's really the output of human creativity that is out there. And this is our island of how we describe reality and how we describe who we are, right? So it's there. So this is the island of knowledge. But of course, as with any island, this island is also surrounded by an ocean. So if the island is the island of knowledge, what is the ocean? Well, it's the ocean of the unknown, what we don't know about reality. So what happens is as we ask questions about the world, about ourselves, the island grows. And then there are two ways of thinking about this. One says, aha, of course, one day the island is going to grow so much that there'll be no more unknowns. We are going to reach the end of knowledge. And people have written books about this. And what my argument says is precisely the opposite. It's that there is no such thing as the end of knowledge because the boundaries of the island, the perimeter of the island that is growing, is also increasing the regions between the known and the unknown. Like as the periphery of the island grows, you ask more questions than you couldn't have asked before.
That prospect for some is threatening, I would think, right? That the idea that science will one day be able to answer all our questions or all the questions that matter is it seems, one of the things that draws a lot of scientists to science. at least the scientists we've talked to. But you see the limits of science as liberating. Could you say about what is attractive about the fact that science is limited?
The idea that science could answer all questions, it's just silly, because how can we possibly even know the kinds of questions we're going to be asking 10, 20, 120, 2,000 years from now, if we're here? We can't. It's impossible to predict anything about the future of knowledge. Who would have imagined the internet 100 years ago? Nobody. So, and the internet has changed the way we think, the way we interact, the way we construct knowledge. And so, to consider the possibility that science will reach a sort of limit, and that is the end of what is knowable, goes against this metaphor, because what I'm exactly saying is that as the island grows, as we know more about the world, there is always more that we do not know. So the process of learning is also the process of being equipped to ask new questions you couldn't have predicted before. And to me, that's just beautiful, because that is what will excite you and motivate you to always learn more. Tom Stoppard, the great British playwright, in his play Arcadia, he has a quote that I love, which is wanting to know that makes us matter. If you could even contemplate, you can't, fortunately, contemplate the end of knowledge, that science could answer all questions, then you won't have anything yet new to know, at least in science. And that's just a profound loss of meaning and the quest to grow as humans, So there is a obvious philosophical reason why that's not possible, which is that knowledge creates new questions. And that has happened on and on and on in the history of science. I mean, there are tons of examples, but just think of the telescope or the microscope, an instrument, a new instrument changed profoundly the way we looked at the universe. Galileo, astronomy before Galileo was naked eye. And then he had this idea of pointing the telescope up, and that revealed a universe that was unknown to anyone but him for a while. And boom, all these new questions came about. Same century, 17th century, Van Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope. Boom, what is life? Wow, you have life in a drop of water. How is that possible? You can even see those things that are alive. So are there limits to that? So all these new instruments, what they are doing is that they are bringing out stuff that we cannot see in the territory, but suddenly we can. So we see, oh, look, there's that little new detail there that this telescope or microscope or MRI machine or whatever it is revealing to me, so I can improve my map a little bit. It's just a little bit, it's not going to be, this is the map of reality. And to me, that's much more interesting than the notion that, guys, the party's over, you've reached the end of knowledge. And that's just silly, right? So as long as we get funded to ask new questions, right? I think science is, as Vannevar Bush said, is the endless frontier. Not just science, everything that we ask about ourselves, is the endless frontier. And that to me is much more interesting as a worldview than the worldview that, yes, we have the power with our minds to conquest everything and become godlike through our knowledge of nature.
Yeah, that's an interesting. So, what you're bringing up also resonates with a certain kind of critique of science, a more sort of feminist critique of science, which sees it as a kind of mode of conquest, right? So science is about, from that perspective, imposing our will on reality, controlling it, manipulating it. And you can see it in the metaphors, right? Like whether it's like, not even metaphors, like we're smashing particles together, right? Or like dissecting animals or whatever. And so there's a certain violence intrinsic to the methods that we're using, which is a little bit, it seems, dissonant with your portrayal of science as a sort of spiritual quest and almost a sense of communing with nature, if I could use those words. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like there is a sort of quest for union with nature or something like that. Could you say a bit? Could you respond to that?
Right. So this is a whole other story, which is the motivation, right? I mean, why, right? To me, I've been very excited these days about asking people, but what is your why? And why do you do what you do? And I think that's such a fundamental question to ask, right? And it's funny because the way I came across this was not through science, but through one of my hobbies. I'm a long distance runner, and I do these really, really long races, like, 100-kilometer races and stuff. And one of the conversations that we have in this community is, what is your why? Why do you subject yourself and your body to such things, right? And that uncovers, what is the motivation for doing what you do. And it would be a really interesting research topic for you in particular, to go and start talking to people about that in the scientific sphere. Because what is it that motivates? Why do you wake up as a biologist or as an anthropologist or a sociologist? Why do you ask questions that you're asking right now? Right. And to me, my why am I a scientist, is exactly what you just said. It is my way of connecting in a much deeper way, which is not just rational, but is also emotional and spiritual, with the mystery of existence. So, science is one mechanism, is one process that we have developed to kind of ask questions about the nature of who we are in ways that we can understand. And the beauty of it is that it's a universal language, more or less, but in principle, is a universal language that we can share, across cultures, across religious beliefs, etc. Right? And sort of like to illustrate what I mean, you go back to the word religion. What is the meaning of the word religion, right? And so there are two different kind of like discussions about this word. One of them is it's about relegere, which is to reread, right, from the Latin. So you're rereading the book. But to me, that's not the interesting one. To me, the other one is religion, is religare. It's reconnect, right? Now, reconnect with what? Well, in our current 21st century narrative, I think the most fundamental reconnection that we can try to achieve is a reconnection with nature, with the natural world. And that is the connection that we have essentially destroyed in the last 300 years or so of industrial growth. And that is the connection that, because we have lost it, is creating all sorts of existential problems and also existential threats to humanity and to life on Earth. So I look at science as a bridge between our deepest sense of understanding that there is something much bigger than we are out there, and this need that we humans have of bringing meaning out of our existence, to the why. Why do you wake up? What is your meaning? What is your quest? And not a quest as let's conquest something, but a quest as let's find what drives you to become a better human. And so this relationship that I see between science and spirituality, to me, is really a relationship that brings out human flourishing. It really is about finding with humility this deep bridge, which, yes, has reason in it, obviously, because it's science, but the motivation, the why, is not rational. It's the why is subjective, and that subjectivity is the awe that I feel, and I'm sure many, many other scientists feel from your study, you can tell me, when you are in the process of either observing something, people talk about the Grand Canyon, but also the overview effect, the astronauts that go out into space and look at the Earth as a whole, that come back completely spiritualized. That to me is what's behind at least my passion for knowledge through science.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, it does resonate with what we're finding. I mean, one of the things we're trying to argue based on what we're seeing in our international study of scientists is that Science is a sort of aesthetic quest. I mean, it really is at its heart a quest for the beauty of understanding, right? So I think that you'd mentioned the distinction between truth and just sort of understanding from our own perspective reality as opposed to grasping the ultimate truth. So for most scientists, it does seem that science is about experiencing the pleasure of understanding. When you gain an insight into the mechanisms of how things work, behind appearances, behind the veil of phenomena, to grasp this is how things are. And you could be wrong, but it's still worth striving for that, even if you make mistakes and even if your knowledge is provisional and can be revised. It seems that that's what's driving a lot of scientists now. But there are mixed motives, right? I mean, there's also the kind of rat race that scientists, like a lot of others, are caught up in and chasing after, whether it's grants and whether it's the sort of competition where one group wins at the expense of another, et cetera. And all those things certainly get in the way. And then the hubris of thinking we're arriving at some ultimate end to knowledge, right? I mean, all of that is present, certainly. But I think one of the challenges is, how do we preserve this quest for the beauty of understanding in the face of these threats? And I wonder if you have any suggestions for. There are a lot of scientists who are burnt out because of job market insecurity, because of just the pressure to publish. The standards these days for succeeding and surviving in science are much higher than they used to be. Would you have any advice for those who are still, trying to strive towards this pursuit of this kind of beauty of understanding?
Yeah, that's a very, very important topic of conversation because it is really hard. When I tell people, how long does it take for you to become a professor in academia in the sciences in the United States? And people go, wow, that's as long as medical school, And I'm like, yeah, because you have your bachelor's and then you usually have you have to do your 5-year PhD, and then you have at least 2 postdocs, that's another 4 to 5 years. Add this up, and it is a very, very long. And the only thing that I can say that I think is what kept me going when, because we all face our fears, we all face our unknowns as we move through this highly competitive world. And honestly, it's not just science, it's everywhere. It's not just in academia, it's every profession. The difference that academia is much more restricted as a job market. There are only so many evolutionary biologists or theoretical cosmologists that universities can hire, right? And unless you want to go to industry, if you want to keep, because, you can be a phenomenal scientist in industry as well. It doesn't have to be in academia. But the thing that kept me going through all this is, I think that I always ask myself, why am I doing this? I never lost sense of my why. And I've always felt that, yes, the rat race and publish or perish and the competition and people, I had a mentor at Fermilab, a guy that I admire a lot. His name is Edward Kolb, Kolb. He goes by Rocky. And when I was doing well in my early career, he says, beware, because as soon as you are the wolf ahead of the pack, there'll be a bunch of wolves behind you trying to buy your back. And that kind of mindset is just awful, right? But it does reveal a lot of the academic world, right? That there is envy, there is competition, there is ego. And the problem is really not academia. The problem is humanity. These are not problems that academia created. These are problems that we have as human beings. We are competitive, we are greedy, we are ambitious. And that is where you have to look at this. It's not so much academia makes you evil. Yeah, go to Wall Street, go to a law
Right, right,
firm.
right.
I mean, what are you talking about? It's actually, so in a sense, I find it a life of privilege to be able to dedicate your time to the pursuit of knowledge, and not just the pursuit of knowledge, but also to the education of others, about the beauty of what we have discovered. So why do you wake up every morning? Because every morning there is a promise of a new discovery, and there is a promise of inspiring a young mind, to follow this path of discovery. And that, to me, is what's behind the whole thing, right? And I remember there were two, in my long career, there were 2 times in my life where I discovered something new that was important. And I remember very clearly that when I was doing a simulation in a computer, I was going against everybody that thought I was wrong. And I was doing a simulation on a computer, and the results started to come out. And I saw that thing on the screen, and I'm like, I am right. And I felt it wasn't rational. It was a completely visceral, I could physically feel sort of like this awe materializing in my body. I'm like, wow, I'm seeing something new here. And that, you just can't replace that. And that is, in my opinion, a deeply spiritual connection with something that is out there that you just grasp the little tiniest bit, but that little tiniest bit is such a bridge into this grand stuff that is out there that is worth dedicating a whole life just for that, and then you write papers about it, yes, and get grants, etc., and influence other people. Now everybody talks about this stuff, so that for the knowledgeable ones, it's about oscillons, which is some kind of like energy blob that exists in nature, right? And people didn't believe they were possible, and they are, and now they're super popular, etc. But the point is not that. The point is the pursuit of knowledge, and it's what Einstein always said. It's not about the accolades; it's about the work. Don't ever kind of lose sense of that, and if you start to think of the accolades more than you start to think about the work, then you're really losing your sense of why.
Well, that's a brilliant note to end on. Marcelo, thank you so much for joining us again today.
My pleasure.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out our show notes for more resources from our guest. And if you like this episode, please be sure to share it with your friends. And please leave us an honest review. We'd love to hear what you think, and it helps to get the word out about our show. Music for the show was provided by Venkat Subramaniam, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. And thanks again to our 2 sponsors, Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. To learn more about our research project on beauty and science, visit wellbeinginscience.com. To learn more about our broader project on beauty at work, visit beautyatwork.net. Thanks again, and see you next time.